Hello and welcome to India Speak, a podcast by the Center for Policy Research. I'm Rohan Venkat. You're listening to CPR Perspectives, a special series commemorating CPR's 50th anniversary, where we bring you one flagship conversation with a CPR faculty member every month. This month, we have Partha Mukhopadhyay, a senior fellow at CPR, who oversees the initiative on cities, economy, and society, as well as the Jobs Initiative. Dr. Mukhopadhyay has spent 17 years at CPR, working on a wide range of subjects, from India's urban transformation to special economic zones to COVID-19. Such a wide range that it's hard to summarize it all. I spoke to him about what we tend to get wrong when it comes to India's cities, why we need to look beyond theories that come out of the global north, and why he would advise younger scholars to take their time exploring lots of ideas before committing to one path. Thank you for being with us here. You've had a long, distinguished career in public policy. You began teaching at Delhi University way back in 1986, and you've worked in the policy field in many different roles ever since. I'd like to take you back a little bit to how you got started. Did you always know you wanted to come into this space, or was it something that you just fell into?
No, I think it is something that I think policy is something that you fall into, especially my generation. So the after the sort of standard year or 2 years, whatever teaching, doing your, some of us left immediately after our masters. A couple of us sort of stayed behind, and then eventually left for your PhD. I think my first brush with quote unquote policy kind of work was I had finished all the requirements for my PhD in terms of taking exams and so on and so forth, and I'd finished them a little early. And I was basically hanging around my department doing nothing. And I think the department thought that I was being a little bit of a distraction for other people. And they told me to go out and find a job, which I did. And it was at the World Bank in Washington. And this was around the time that the wall was coming down in the 1990 and 91. The World Bank had set up the Socialist Economics Reform Unit. I was in a much more traditional thing called the Trade Policy Division, and which also at that time incidentally had people like Arvind Panagaria, who then sort of course came on to be a part of the policy landscape in the last few years, much more actively here in India. And I was on the floor with the Socialist Economics Reform Unit. And so you got to see sort of a lot of that excitement happening all around you, which was fun. I was doing something much more traditional on Kenya at that point in time. But it was a year and a few at the World Bank. And it gave me a sense of what that kind of world is. It also sort of read me an interesting thing about organizations, because I left the World Bank with a distinct feeling that it was full of incredible people, very rich experience, very committed, very smart. But somehow, as an organization, it seemed much less than the sum of its parts. And that sort of also left me that organizations are important in how they bring people together. And over the next, after I came back in 95, was lucky. I knew I was definitely going to come back to India almost immediately. My wife was even more sure and consequently, we landed up in Bangalore, where I was tasked with setting up the first, it's like a learning center, the Exim Bank of India, which was itself not too an older organization at that point in time, was trying to figure out how India had just opened up in 1992. This was 95, small industries in a place like Bangalore and the South, the southern office, Bangalore office took care of Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. And the deal was, how do you get small and medium enterprises to engage with the global market? And the center I was tasked to start up was more or less focused on that question. So I sort of dived into sort of real world problems quite quickly, and also had a pretty good, I mean, apart from and a variety of people on advisory board, people from McKinsey, when then went on to become Diageo, but he also had people like Mr. Rangarajan and Dr. Ahluwalia, Ishra Ahluwalia, who then sort of course, I came to know much better over the time. But the so in that sense, both in terms of insights into how government thinks, as well as a fairly deep immersion into how industry thinks, was pretty early. And then life just sort of moved on because my next job, I was offered a position to start up the Delhi office of IDFC, which was then a fledgling organization tasked with bringing private infrastructure into India. And it just so happened that there were people that tasked with setting up that organization whom I'd known back in my days in Washington. And that's how I landed up in Delhi. And that was 98, and I've been here ever since, which sounds pretty awful. But in a sense, I think the term at IDFC was both exciting because India was creating very new stuff at that point in time, and we were very much at ground zero and very actively engaged with actual policy decisions at the highest levels were going on. So you did get insight, access, and definitely sort of, and there are lots of relationships once built up in those years, which one has held in good stead over the years. And you realize how, I think my fundamental takeaway from that was how, in some sense, I suppose, honest in terms of being true to purpose, the Indian bureaucracy was. These were, make mistakes, they might take the wrong decision, but these were mostly almost guys who were trying their level best, and most of them are very smart people, to actually solve the task that they've been given with, right? And there may be, lots of political economic considerations that sort of get into the space at different points in time, but there is that fundamental streak which I think has held our nation in good stead. That for the most part, these are just hardworking people trying to do an honest day's work. And it's that which I think for me has bred a certain kind of optimism, regardless of when I approach policy now. I know that I do not automatically jump to cynical sort of explanations about why stuff is not happening, that there are deep reasons at play why some things don't go around. That's not my default explanation ever, because that has not been my experience whenever I've interacted with people at these levels intensively. So, and that I think has also helped me since I joined CPR over the last almost 17 years now, I think. Yeah, because it's not it's pretty easy to get discouraged, but it's that sort of helped one keep going, and then you sort of end up in good places from time to time. So.
You mentioned at the start of this that you plunged sort of into real world issues right away. I take that to mean that there was potentially an alternative path line after NYU that would have been just more research into economics.
Sure.
Not
yes, and I did take a short deviation. For example, after a few years at IDFC, I took a leave of absence, ventured on the faculty at IIM Ahmedabad, and perhaps would have continued there, except for the fact that a senior civil servant at that point in time in government decided to try and merge IDFC with SBI, which then required all of us to come back to try and do a rear guard action. It was successful, but at cost of some sacrifices, including that of our MD at that time, Mr. Manji. But the organization was kept together, and then of course it's now evolved into something else altogether. But it could have been a different world for sure. And one has always sort of dabbled in it from time to time. So when I was in Delhi initially, when I had a little bit more time, I used to take courses at the School of Planning. But teaching is a demanding profession. It is also a profession which binds you to certain points in time and being in certain places at certain parts in time. And I soon figured out that I couldn't be fair to my students as well as to whatever else I was doing. And so I have not sort of gone down that way on a regular basis for a very long time now. I mean, there could be short courses. The last serious thing I did was I think for about 6 weeks or so with Ashoka for one of their YIF programs with a colleague, Mari Helen. But one has not sort of, one does the occasional lecture, one has the structure in place, one tries to stay involved, reviewing theses and things like that, but not a full-time course at any academic institute for sure. And definitely not focused on academic publications, though there have been some, but that's not the sort of focus of the kind of stuff we end up doing.
Maybe before we get then specifically to what brought you to CPR and sort of this and your 17 years there since. Before that, you had time in both the States and in India, and I'm curious how that shaped you. I know it's a big conversation amongst younger scholars today about whether to stay in the country, whether to go and access the resources that tend to be a bit more plentiful abroad, even if it's expensive and so on. I wonder how that played for you in your decision of where to be within the policy space.
No, for me, I think it was easy. It was easy because I don't think I ever contemplated staying back. Why I didn't? I am not quite sure why not, but there was not something that I'd ever thought about. And perhaps single child, whatever, I don't know. And sort of when I met my partner there, and then she was as committed to, I mean, perhaps more so to getting back. In fact, she hasn't been back to the States in the last 27 years, 28 years that we've been back. But it's, so consequently, for me, that decision was easy. So I wasn't ever thinking of anything else. But even retrospectively, I honestly don't think I could have made, I think my being here has anybody else in my, there would have been somebody else in my position. What doing the stuff that I did if it wasn't me. And they would have also made their contributions, and they would have made, and the world would have most probably not looked very much different. So I don't think my being where I am at any given point in time has changed anything anywhere, and that would be stupid to think about that. But definitely, one has got the feeling that one has been able to contribute a fair bit to critical decisions that have been made in this country. And I don't think that would have been the case were I back in the United States. I might have had a different career, with a different set of students or somewhere else. Could have even been within the US government in different spaces. Who knows? I mean, but I doubt I've had that kind of satisfaction of making any, because the last times that we have been here are times when India has made sort of step changes. It has made critical decisions that have moved in particular directions. The US, just simply by the fact that they are a country where they are in their stage of development, is not a country that's going to make step changes, though with Trump they almost did. And therefore, the chances to be part of those kinds of changes is much more here back in India than it is if you were in the United States. And to that extent, I think if you're excited about being part of those kinds of things, then this is a nice place to be. But different objectives drive different people. So there are people who would be, I'm sure they're quite excited about discovering certain particular relationships, mathematical relationships that sort of make breakthroughs in particular areas, and they're excited about that. And those kinds of things, most probably, one would be better off there simply because of the collegiality and the kind of resources and structure that you might end up doing, and things like that. So there are differences, of course, that you sort of end up doing. Yes. It's more or less, I think, dependent on what is it that is driving you and what is it that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think people would dispute your characterization of yourself and your work and the influence on the field and the space. But it also strikes me that those early years did coincide with India's economy opening up and a sense of a lot of change here. And as you say, this continues to be a place where significant things, at least in the field, may be happening, and that probably has something to do with your choice. I would assume. You mentioned it, whether it was Exim or IDFC, then there were interesting opportunities for the India story that have not yet or remain. So what brought you then to CPR in 2006?
IDFC listed in 2005, and it was on its way to becoming the initial sort of groundbreaking had been done, and the time was then to sort of, in some sense, reap the fruits of that kind of thing that had been laid in place. And I guess for me at that point, it wasn't the kind of stuff that was happening then, and the kind of role it was going to play was not as exciting anymore as it was. I'd been there for, including the time away at IIM, almost 7 years by then, so a fair chunk. And one of the things that academia and policy, etc. You thought about going back to academia. In fact, my first foray back was actually with XLRI in Jamshedpur when I was teaching immediately after I left IDFC. And then I even spent a whole year in Sri Lanka with a consulting firm, essentially working with the government of Sri Lanka on their highways program. But what when Pratap sort of asked, what was exciting was, in some sense, the ability to deploy the kind of skills that one had picked up, the engagement with policy, with the sort of freedom of academia, that you were answerable only to yourself, so to speak. And I was also at that time shifting. I'd done a lot of stuff with infrastructure and privatization, and I was looking for a new space. And one of the issues that sort of came up over the last few years when I was there was this whole transformation that was taking place in terms of the urban transformation. And I had the sense that we weren't thinking hard enough about it. As the people are working on cities and people are working on the village, the process of transformation itself, and there are obviously some very bright scholars working on it, but given the scale of the issue, I thought there was space for some new thinking in that area. And with Mr. Shivram Krishnan, who was then the chair of CPR at that point in time, whom I had known briefly in interactions during my time at IDFC. It seemed to be an interesting place to come and try out. And that's what it turned out to be. So it's a space that has kept me intellectually excited, engaged, and enables you to sort of have that same feeling of contribution but more importantly, also sort of this space where you can, I think that's a characteristic of CPR, is where you have the space and time to try and thoroughly understand the problem before you're not firing from the hip. When you are taking positions, it's a position that comes out of work over a considerable period of time. And it may not be directly related, but sort of because you have put in that effort, you're able to sort of respond on different questions across a wide range. And that's the kind of space at that point in time, in fact, even today, I don't see any other institute. And that's a pity, because you want more institutes like CPR to be out there, being able to sort of provide. And most importantly, I think at CPR are your colleagues. It is what makes CPR what it is, because you are in an atmosphere where everybody is interested in trying to do something. They're all smart people with whom you can have very productive conversations. And in all these years across so many colleagues, there may be very few instances where one might think of people who are not genuinely collegial. There isn't, the level of rancor is so amazingly low in the institution. At least my own personal experience, that it's not You think with so many smart people floating around, they'd all be sort of at each other's throats. But these are all people who are very self-assured. They don't. Very few of them have stuff that they are trying to prove or show off to anybody, and therefore, there are a lot of people are generally at peace with themselves, and therefore, people with whom you can really have very productive discussions because they're all quite open to opening up about what they would like to do and do something like this.
For those who may not be as familiar, I want to pick on one thing you mentioned at the start of talking about choosing CPR as being sort of a choice between the sort of work you were doing a little bit before at IDFC or at the Exim Bank versus going into academia proper. You said CPR offered you something that was a bit different from either of those options, let's say. What is that difference? What do you get to do here that's not the same as being at a university?
So at a university, you also have to teach, which is important. I think it's productive. It also does take up a lot of your time. So there's only so much of other research that you can do. And it's usually, therefore, that's why university professors end up being very focused. The other things with university academia is they're also within departments, so you would sort of stay within particular disciplines. What CPR allows you is it's like full-time research, so in that sense exciting. You miss sometimes, as I said, the excitement of bouncing your ideas of young minds and so on and so forth, which is what UNIF professors get to do, and I think pay much the better for it. But at the same time, you do have a lot more time to define what you want to do. It's a place where you do have to try and get funding for it and so on and so forth, but there's a place where you can actually pick the kind of work that you want to do. And secondly, it allows you're not constrained by discipline. So you have sociologists, anthropologists, climate scientists, doctors, engineers, strategy, IR people, and economists, political scientists across the range, with whom you can have, who can bring, especially in policy kinds of issues. It's exhilarating to have that kind of multidimensional sort of conversation, to be able to see what exactly might be a problem and how one could sort of get around it, which is difficult to create. I mean, universities have been trying to create these kinds of multidisciplinary spaces for a long time, but they haven't succeeded very much. So that's one of the things that I think is, I mean, if to look at universities, that would be a big difference. Both one is, of course, the ability to do much more time for research, and the second is the multidisciplinary quality of that structure. So these two things, and you get a lot more freedom to design what you want to do and structures, and raise funding for it, put it together, which in Indian universities today is still complicated. In some places it's easier, harder, etc. So that's kind of structure that I think would be, so CPR in that sense does offer the best of both worlds, but as I said, caveats.
So again, maybe just to make that a bit more concrete for someone, you work across a diverse range of subjects. I think you'd be known for your work on urban policy or on SEZs. But over the last couple of years, you've also done work on COVID. How, if you could give me an example maybe of the sort of multidisciplinary work you've been able to do, or how this slightly different space has allowed you to go down different paths.
So, I mean, for example, let's say more recently, there's always been a core. I've never studied anything except economics in my life, so there's obviously a handicap that I have. But consequently, but I do have, for example, let's say three kinds of last 10, 12 years or so. We were involved in working with the CCSAT, the Committee for Consultations on the Situation in Andhra Pradesh, which is basically the committee, the Sri Krishna committee, which is involved in recommending whether or not Andhra Pradesh should remain a state or should be divided into Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, which eventually became. And one of our tasks, as it's sort of there, was to try and understand how to think about the city of Hyderabad and how that structure came through, but not just from that context, but more much wider context, because this was in the context of a state bifurcation. That kind, so that was one sort of, which sort of brought what was at one level an urban problem in a much wider context. Then later one was involved in the restructuring of something which took me back to my early years of the Indian Railways. One of the things which we shall see how it's working out. Obviously, the railways have been in the news recently for being, one of the drivers of capital expenditure in India, etc., etc. One of the things that we had actually recommended, which got accepted, which was the practice of a separate railway budget, which had been in place for over 90 years at that point in time, had been discontinued and now part of the union budget, with attendant consequences. And a variety of other things, but it is again something that would be different for somebody, let's say, working on just urban kinds of issues. People are just working in that space. And then there was the work that one did with the Committee for the Allocation of Natural Resources, which was Committee of the Cabinet Secretariat, which then looked at across natural resources of India, whether it was issues around things like telecom spectrum to urban land to forest to minerals, across that kind of range, and coal. And out of that engagement, one of my young colleagues who worked with us at that point in time, Rohit Chandra, then went on to get interested in coal. Went on to do his PhD at Harvard on it, and is now a visiting fellow with us and also a faculty member at IIT Delhi in the new School of Public Policy. So it's that kind of breadth, and and then there was, of course, the urban work. So I was the chair of the interministerial working group across different ministries on migration. Is that 2016, a lot of those things, fortunately, were helpful when we confronted the COVID migration story. And as you mentioned, of course, work on COVID. First time I found myself publishing in a medical journal with colleagues across within CPR and outside CPR. So it is, so that kind of breadth, of course, I wouldn't find. But also the other thing, I did mention the fact that I miss students, but one of my big satisfactions at CPR, I think, is if I look at the people, younger people one has worked with, a number of them went on to do their PhDs at some of the best institutes in the world and the best universities in the world. So if we were, in some sense, a university with a placement record, we would do pretty well. People who have worked with me at CPR or with in our group would be, whether it's at the King's in London, whether it's at Harvard, at Yale, at Brown, Georgia Tech, the Minnesota. So there's a range that saw Berkeley. There is this whole range that one sort of Sciences Po. It's also exciting to see people come in, spend those times here, and then move on to other institutions. And then there are people, even in India, from who have gone on to complete their thesis from places like IIT Delhi and JNU and so on and so forth. So it's it gives also to us, I think, affirmation that the people who spend their time here do actually end up adding to themselves in a manner that people and competing with people who are coming from great academic institutions elsewhere, they can compete with the best of them. And that's useful confirmation about the kind of stuff that we do at CPR. And especially, not only that, it's also the kind of people we build at CPR, because it's important to us that whatever quote-unquote the spirit of inquiry that drives the institution is something that is passed on to younger people who flow through it. And some of them come back, and others, for example, like Namita sort of spent some early time with us, went on to do a PhD at Harvard, then came back and joined us. So it's been so in that sense very affirming also at that level. So at both those levels, in terms of the breadth as well as in this affirmation of the kind of places that people kind of end up with, I don't think one would have had exactly that kind of experience in an academic institution.
So if I could then turn the focus from the institution a little bit to your work. It's a bit hard to characterize it for those who are not familiar today, because of, I think, fingers in many different pies. If you had to give a short summary of what you're looking at specifically now, how you see your role today at CPR, what is it that animates your days?
No, today at CPR, it's some of it is hopefully just regular stuff that you end up doing. For example, my current hobby horse is to try and argue for fare free public transport. I believe that it is fiscally possible and ecologically responsible to have free buses across all Indian cities. And that's something that I'll sort of start to just kicking off in some sense. But aside from that, more of my time right now, I think, is helping people ask, or rather acting as a sounding board to help them figure out whether or not they're asking the right questions. And making sure that the kinds of work that one was able to do at CPR, other people would continue to do once one leaves the place. Because I was fortunate and lucky that I stepped into CPR at a time when someone like Mr. K.C. Ramakrishnan was there with the kind of administrative experience, natural curiosity, and intellectual bandwidth that he had. And it sort of then becomes incumbent, while I don't think I'm anywhere in that space, to try and ensure that when one moves on, there are people at CPR who they don't have to do the same thing, maybe doing very different things, but who essentially feel comfortable in sort of asking the same kinds of questions, that they're able to ask their own questions, and they're able to sort of continue the kinds of As I said, the spirit of curiosity that is there. And so that's the second kind of thing. So just to try and ensure that people feel that they're able to and are comfortable doing that. That's the second kind of thing that one would do. And I think increasingly also in certain respects, in specific situations when one is working directly with government, to take on some critical pictures where one can possibly sort of add some value because of one's experience in interacting with government per se and understanding how government sort of works, which someone who may be a much better researcher than I am may not have had that opportunity to engage with, and sort of bring that little piece of value into the space, which then can sort of act as a catalyst to sort of then make those policy engagements much richer and productive, one hopes. So that's the kind of space that one is currently engaged with. CPR. It all sounds a bit sort of fluffy and not particularly useful, and it's quite possibly true. But that's broadly what one sort of is engaged in at this stage. But yes, one has to, at any given point in time, you must ensure that you are, to my mind at least, engaged in something specific and concrete. That's your own research. Otherwise, the chances that you'll just become what a talking head is much higher.
And on that note, you mentioned one of the things that you've been able to do. One of the things that you say is unique to this institution that you're not necessarily able to see elsewhere in India is the ability to stick to a question over a period of time, to really attack it from multiple angles and spend time understanding it. What would you say? My assumption is that the answer to this is something to do with cities, but how would you define that question for you?
Different things, I think. One on which perhaps I should spend more time is the notion of informal work, which I haven't sort of actually spent as much time perhaps that I should have had, because one has been consumed. The second is, of course, yes, in a sense, I think we have been both within the academic discourse nationally and internationally when it comes to India. And even within the discourse in policy circles in India, I think made the case that one should be looking at not just the large megacities, not just they're very important. The Bombays and the Delhis and the Bangalores and the Kolkatas, all of that are very important. And Chennai's and Ahmedabad and Surat. But there is a very large number of people, and often a growing number of people, who live in mid-sized cities and some living in even smaller cities, where a lot of transformation is happening and where a lot of what is the vibrancy that drives the Indian economic growth engine is powered by. So India, fortunately, is, it's not just a double engine story. It is a story of multiple small engines that sort of work across different spaces. And it is sort of bringing, these engines have always existed. It is to sort of make, just like migrants have always existed and have always powered our cities, and it's only during COVID that they sort of came into prominence. I think we have helped a little bit in making sure that these spaces, the mid-sized cities and the smaller cities, have their day in the sun and are considered more seriously within the policy discourse. So that's, I think, one of the things that I would say it began fragmentarily, but I think we started off with this project that we called somewhat tongue-in-cheek subaltern urbanization about 10 odd years ago. And sort of holding that story through, and I think lots of people are now sort of moving on and putting that structure forward, is something that I think is really been a long-term space as far as India is concerned going forward. There is, for things like the issues, etc., I wish I were wrong. It was something that one it sort of did, and most of my work in that space has largely been to throw cold water. One wouldn't want. Those are the kinds of things that don't give you much happiness, because it's you actually do want things to happen that will make India move on. And the fact that some policies weren't really something that would help it, and that it was that government spent a lot of time doing these kinds of things when they could have been doing something else is not you sort of provide a certain kinds of validation for people when the time comes to say, yes, this stuff doesn't work, but it does not particularly sort of contributing positively in some sense. Though I remember a former chief economic advisor saying that the job of the finance ministry is not really to get anything right, it's just to make sure that wrong ideas don't take root. And the right ideas will just take root as long as you have space for them anyway. So it depends on how you think about what your role in the system is.
Well, one of the things I like to ask scholars and experts is what misconceptions about your field in particular this started off as a question about the media. What were we in the media getting wrong about your area of expertise? But I would have sort of expanded to say not just the media, but also fellow scholars, students, the lay public, and I see a through line in some of the work, particularly on cities, of the idea that Indian cities are big engines of growth, that India is migrating to its cities, that what we need are smarter cities. I see a through line of trying to debunk some of these also in this question that you answer.
It's not debunk in the sense that, look, I mean, not really in a sense. Yes, there is not much of that is happening. Most of our migration is to the next district over in a rural area, right? So that's one of the things. It's not as if hordes of people are leaving our villages and dropping into our cities, which is what some people sort of tend to characterize it. The second thing that is really this thing is somehow, for all the work that's been done on this stuff, people still seem to think of migration as something bad. It is this old do bigha zameen kind of characterization that somehow migrants are leaving their space because not out of choice, but because they are being forced to leave, being pushed out rather than being pulled into other spaces. Migration is an act of desperation, not an act of seizing opportunity. And I don't want to belittle, I think, a significant, though to my mind, I think a minority chunk where that is actually true, that it is that these people are being pushed out. It is an act of desperation. And especially with climate and stuff, where it's possible there will be more of that story. But for the large part, migration is essentially about seizing opportunity. And those opportunities may look very, you may not be able to relate to them. It's hard to relate to a Mumbai taxi driver who goes home to a shared bed. But that person is sharing a bed and not bringing, it's like a 12-hour shift, right? 12 hours, somebody's in one bed, guy goes out, somebody else comes in. But that person is doing that because he's minimizing the expenses in the city, because what he is doing is maximizing the surplus that he's sending back to the village, where his child is then getting educated. Intriguingly enough, in a pretty good quality school, they may have sprung up not too far from where he lives in his village. And that child, when is educated in that school, may then have a completely different life world and a different set of choices and chances, which he is able to see. His being in Mumbai allows him to see the kinds of opportunities that people with certain types of human capital have. And yes, this person will not get the same opportunities as somebody who's going to Bombay Scottish, because life is not just about human capital, it's also about social capital. It's also about who your parents are, who your friends are. But it will be a step change. It can be a definite step change from where that person who's a taxi driver in Bombay today is. And for him to go through what looks like a pretty dismal life, to make what he sees as seizing opportunity, enabling his children to seize opportunities that he could never have dreamt of. That kind of transformation is not what people see. They see the squalor, they see the person in that structure, and oftentimes one could do much better. There's no reason why that person should be living, or why housing costs should be the way there is. There's no reason why, but that's true whether it's in New York, whether in various places, etc. And could we do much better? Yes. Is everything that is in Bombay housing right? No. But it isn't all about distress. And it is this sort of, how do we create conditions that people are able to seize opportunity? They feel empowered enough to seize opportunity. How can we make those conditions happen? That's fundamentally what drives, I suppose, the way I think about development and change in India. That's the thrust of, and which is why, when my colleagues who were excited about NREGS and so on and so forth, to me, it was never about, helping step migration back, doing some, or even fairly skeptical about them, sort of whether they'll build real assets and stuff like that, and so on and so forth. But the fact that there's a safety net is important, because while I would prefer to think about springboards, and that's how I sort of think about safety nets and springboards, it's important for government to focus on both, because only with safety nets you're not going to get very far. But it's very difficult for people to start to jump off springboards unless they're aware that there is a net underneath in case they fall. Right? But it's important, therefore, to also focus on what are the things that government can do that can provide these kinds of springboards. And it's this balance between safety nets and springboards that I think is fundamental to government policy as you think about cut through all the cacophony. That's fundamentally what you're looking for. Is this Is this working as a safety net? Is this working as a springboard? Where is that stuff going forward?
To take it back to maybe not that person then who's gone to Bombay, but to what you mentioned earlier, the question of sort of subaltern urbanization. What again, maybe if you could very quickly.
Let me tell you a different story. One of, I think, perhaps the most striking, the story I always tell about policy change in India is Vajpayee's, the way he worked when the Prime Minister's Task Force Infrastructure was set up. It essentially started off from his vision of building the north-south, east-west corridors from Saurashtra to Silchar and Kashmir to Kanyakumari. And then, in order to finance that and the Golden Quadrilateral, etc., and a bunch of things, they started to levy this cess on fuel. At that time, it was a rupee a liter. Then went up to 18 rupees, now it's come down to 5 and 2 rupees. And there was a lot of pushback, especially from farmers who said, why should we pay for this extra money on diesel? Because what are we getting out of it? We don't use those fancy highways that you're talking about. So what is in it for us? And I think, to me, it was an astounding act of political imagination from the then Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee, who basically said, yes, that's right. And here is what I'm going to do to fix it. And he says, half the money that comes in from the diesel cess will go to build rural roads. The beginning of the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, the Prime Minister's Rural Roads Program. And now there are, 700,000 kilometers of rural roads across this country. And I think it has been the most transformative infrastructure intervention done by any government, definitely in the last 30 years. Definitely post-91 kind of story. In trying to ensure that this country grows together, I think that would be, to my mind, the most important piece of infrastructure intervention which comes through. And what that enabled, let's say, small town near a place like Balurghat or something in North Bengal do, is this is a town which is to make a third small town. And what it did is suddenly it expanded its market for, because it's a perishable thing, you can only take it so far. There are only so many people in your neighborhood which can do it. But now you could reach Malda, you could reach Balurghat, you could reach somewhere else all within an hour, just because you had this extra connectivity that was improving, both on the trunk as well as on the smaller roads in. And this particular perfectly old-fashioned, simple industry just moved. And it changed the incomes of people in this small place. And then from then on, it builds up demands for transport, builds up demands for education, varieties of other changes start coming in. And it's these pretty small kinds of, but very basic kinds of things that work in certain spaces that can make a change to what we call in situ urbanization, the transformation of work where you are without the movement. But it also enables somebody who is worried that, should I take my chances and go off to Malda, or maybe just go off to Siliguri or some such nearby place, or even Kolkata or Delhi. It enables a person to take that leap because they now have enough of a surplus at home that if that bed doesn't work out, they're not going to be left completely high and dry, right? So it isn't as if that because you're doing well in your village or in the stuff which is no longer a farming village, and now we have come to a situation where only about, let's say, 2/3 of our people in rural areas are actually on the farm, maybe less. About half our income is from non-farm activities. Uh, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't move. Because what we know from migration is the guys who move are often at the upper end of the scale because they are the ones who mobility requires resource. And what this does is push people over the threshold whereby they think it's okay to try. So in situ urbanization and the old-fashioned urbanization through migration, both of them are forces that are not sort of they could very well work in tandem. They're not inimical to each other. And it's this kind of multifaceted process of transformation that is important for people to understand, because we often tend to think much more linearly and in silos and say, okay, what can we do to do this and stop that? So this is one household. There'll be some guy trying to do this, another guy trying to do that. At the level of the household, the smallest level, not just at the village and so on and so forth, there are people trying out different strategies because it's a complex and certain world, and we don't know what will succeed. And if all of those succeed, that's wonderful. But even if some of those succeed, this household is going to be way better in the future than what its past has been. And it's trying to and a lot of our work on suburban urbanization, and for example, at the other end, we have a place like, say, like Tiruchengodu, which is a small town in Tamil Nadu, which basically made its name making drilling rigs. They re-engineered trucks, refitted them, strengthened them, turned them into drilling rig machines, and they ended up not only sort of building a drilling rig business across the region and across South India, but given the robustness of their technology and their cost, they became often able to export to places in Africa and other places where you were looking for much more rugged, lower cost solutions. So, and this is out of innovation that happened in a relatively small town, right? And this is not unusual. If I look at China, for instance, you have exactly the same kinds of major city like Yiwu, which is the sort of beginning of the railway to Europe, is essentially a marketplace. The city sort of aggregates a whole host of products across small businesses in that entire region, which then uses it as some kind of a huge city mall, so to speak, to be a trading structure, etc. But a lot of that excitement and energy and ability to build and innovate and deliver and manufacture is at relatively small scale. The Foxconn factories in Shenzhen are the imagination of what one has of Chinese manufacturing. But the real transformation that has taken place in China is not just driven by those Foxconns. It's driven by these much smaller places spread out across a much wider range of smaller towns, which has led to the kind of economy that China has today. Otherwise, it would just have been an enclave economy. Right? So it's bringing this kind of these are the kinds of pathways to transformation that you're having. And if you're just focusing on the big guys, you're missing out a lot of the action. And that is something that one has been trying to convey, and partly successfully, over the last few years.
I'm curious, yeah, in the period since, you've started focus on this in subaltern, I mean, the focus both on census towns and subaltern urbanization. Have you seen the conversation shift? Do you see a greater focus either from
Census
government?
towns, I think, have become fashionable now, for sure. But I think it's people would still sort of, oh, why don't we just give them urban status? Frankly, it doesn't matter in many cases. In a state like Kerala, for instance, you have a Department of Local Self-Government, and this is another of these sort of, we're talking about a big issue that want to think about, is a lot of our schemes across India are separated into this urban and rural kind of story. And that separation, to my mind, is often not very productive. Because states and local governments have to rejig, rework. For example, one of the clever things that some states did when they were doing the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana for urban is they figured out, oh, okay, this Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana allows me to not just work in the urban local body, which is the municipal limits, but if I have a development authority or something like that, it allow me to sort of work in those spaces. Oh, very good. So some states took that up, and then suddenly you see all these Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana urban in places which are not urban. But because they fall within this development authority, which was sort of allowed under the administrative bypass, so to speak. So some bureaucrats get clever and find ways around it. And in many cases, these kinds of bifurcations lead to inefficient use of resources in particular areas. And sometimes people might feel there'll be higher taxes in urban areas, there'll be different tax regime, etc. So why be in a panchayat? I have a lot more control as a local politician. I get my MG and RAGS funds, etc., etc. I'm much better off being a village than a city. So there is, as I say, in one of the sites that we worked in, there was a definite tension between the bazaar and the basti. The bazaar wanted to be urban, but the basti wanted to remain rural because of the nature of work in these two kinds of places. So it is, and there really is no reason why you can't have common local governments taking care of local government functions. And in a place like India, where today's rural will be tomorrow's urban, you need to be able to have that flexibility and intertwining that allows local government to deliver whatever services it needs. So urban transport may not be the most important thing for a village, but it may be incredibly important for an urban area. And therefore, if some local guy has able to, lots of places have therefore figured it out. So you have district guys giving out licenses for three-wheelers, which are then acted entirely as, local transport services connecting villages and cities to local towns and structures. And you're making do because that's what you are limited by the way the world is structured into separate boxes of urban and rural. So it's that's the other kind of it's a big thing to take aim at. We now have constitutional amendments that will go back to 92, two separate parts. So it isn't something that one can sort of take off easily. It's something that states can bypass, blur, because there's nothing that is preventing states from giving what is functions in the 11th schedule to people in rural areas and or urban areas, and functions in the 12th schedule to people in rural areas, because these are not mandated, they are recommendatory. So states can be much more creative and imaginative, and perhaps one should sort of work much more on those lines. So that's the other kind of space that I think would be really important to sort of look at if one is looking in that space. The other space which sort of makes this huge thing, which is where I think more action is happening, is the other thing I said about the informal and formal workforce. The other big myth that sort of goes around is 90x% of India is informal. What do you exactly mean by that? And once you sort of start breaking that up, you realize that maybe it's not as much, and much less, in fact. And especially if you then start asking yourself, if you can go ahead and give what is it that a formal sector worker expects from to have? And let's say there are benefits like retirals, there are benefits like health insurance, and so on and so forth. These are all things that, for example, now, in any case, pension benefits are, though now there's a lot of talk around the table, old pension benefits, new pension benefits, how should pension benefits be structured? But even government pensions today are contributory. And you're essentially opening that up to a wide range of people. That's one of the things that the government has been doing. The second is to open up health insurance to a wider range of people. We're beginning that with PMJ, but you can extend that space along the areas. And if you start doing that, you realize that the distinction between what you call formal work and informal work starts to blur, especially as in your own work, as you will see the distinction between quote unquote formal 9-to-5 templated jobs and quote unquote what is now gig work kind of stories, and where you're taking a lot of the structures becoming more and more. So what are the kinds of things that in the US you associated health insurance with employers, and Europe you've had it much more with the government, and that sort of changed the way in which work relations between labor and capital have held between these two countries. So it's there are things that we need to sort of think about much more carefully rather than try to box them into these little boxes going forward. The same is true for skilling, which is now, I think, increasingly being recognized as something that is a lifelong process. That isn't a period. There's not like a 4 ashramas where you have a brahmacharya ashram where you sort of learn, and then you have a grihast ashram where you sort of work kind of story. But it is a process where you flow in and out of these kinds of structures going forward. So we have the opportunity to be able to be at the vanguard of many of these changes, because our workforce is the one that's transitioning into this new world of work. And we don't have to take it through the same pathways that the old world of work has gone through. We can leapfrog. But whether or not we have the imagination to do that is something that we'd have to see. But so if you're talking about big themes that one would sort of concern us and one sort of is working on at this moment, that would be in these kinds of, they're all related to transformations. And they're all related to the particular kinds of circumstances in which a country like India finds itself. And the excitement of actually being able to be at the forefront of change that we really can actually be. But we often, though we do talk of ourselves being the Vishwa Guru and the rest of it, it's sometimes I don't think we focus as much on what we can actually seriously do that will really be an exemplar to how the world sort of sees itself, both in terms of work and living.
Each one of those is fascinating. I think I could spend hours peppering you with questions about any one of them. But maybe a big picture question to sort of look at this over the time that you've been able to observe, let's say, urban policy amongst many other things, including work and migration and so on. Does the capacity of government, whether national, regional, local, and the policy space to understand these things, to think in new ways, to tackle some of these questions, have you found that being linearly more complex, where things are getting better in terms of being able to access some of these? Are there cycles? Do you see a vast difference from where it was 15 years ago, 20 years ago? I'm curious whether there's space for analysis or optimism there.
Because there is a lot more resources and action in the states. There is, I think, more thinking and experimentation at states. This is very similar to what sort of China went through in its own reforms phase, and that I think is encouraging. So that there will be different kinds of things tried out in different places, and I think that's an important part of the story. But it also comes with the fact that currently there is a center which sort of, again, almost Chinese. I get very worried when I hear the word one. So one district, one product, one nation, one election, one something. Because great if that one is the right thing. If it's not, you have a heck of a lot to undo, right? And in an environment that's constantly changing, you would expect that right thing to evolve and change. And if you have 10 different things happening out there, you're much more able to figure out what kind of change, which directions you might want to go to, if there are 10 experiments taking place. And that, I think, is what stood China in great stead in, let's say, between 1990 and 2005, that kind of story, or even 1985, first 30 years after, 15, 20 years after they moved on, right? So in that sense, I think, so there is that story, but there is also, and this government is more assertive, but this tendency of seeking uniform solutions is a characteristic of union governments. I mean, these guys are just a little bit more assertive about it, but it's not that previous governments didn't have this kind. And the other thing that sort of is actually constant, and which is also worrying, and which is why one is eventually, and especially in India, because we have a situation where our bureaucrats are fixed term, they're there for a certain period of time and move on, whether the district, whether the top level, whether the middle. You tend to look for a magic bullet solution. What is one or two things I can do that will now fix it? There really is a magic bullet solution. Even when there is one, there are many other things that need to be done to make sure that that stuff works. It's true, let's say when you move from into these, away from toll road contracts to annuities, to then hybrid annuities and structures, etc. Evolution is not entirely true in terms of really the magic bullet sort of get moved something in place, right? So gross cost contract in urban transport, sure, I think it's a wonderful idea. It's something that we started off way back in Delhi, and it's now been picked up enormously across spaces. And that's the other thing I would like to sort of also highlight. There's a lot of ideas get introduced at a given point in time, but then they actually spread much, much later in a much wider space. And that incubation period can be very short, a few months, or it can be very long. That's about a decade or longer. And it's just could things have happened earlier? Sure, but sometimes they just things times come. So that particular characteristic of searching for the magic bullet solution is something that is also consistent across governments over time. And that's, I think, where we in policy come across as dampeners. And you might end up with some consultants who sort of say, yes, we have it, and here's what we need to do. And then eventually the world sort of settles down, and people who have been, we find our best interlocutors are people, bureaucrats who've been through that cycle, have realized that this is a complex problem. And that's when I think institutions like ours add most value, because you recognize what is it that they actually bring to the table.
I also wanted to jump back to one thing you mentioned earlier. You said that we don't necessarily take advantage of the ways in which India can be an exemplar on some of these things. I remember reading in one of the pieces on subaltern urbanization, the point made that we need to go beyond urbanization theories that were developed in the global north, and pushing forward on the theorization, at least in India, would be useful, beyond India. So I'm curious if there's something there, like, one, if you could expand on that just a little bit before we get, I know I've taken plenty of your time already, but on this idea that India can be an exemplar, and particularly if you have, something specific in mind also, are there things that you think, like you said, that where the incubation period can be sped up, or where those ideas need to spread quicker, that you would like to point to?
There are lots of, look, the core thing about on the urbanization front was agglomeration is the big sort of theoretical insight that sort of came through big cities, lots of people, what we call economists call thick markets. But also as economists, one of the things we don't know is at what scale it starts to kick in, right? After all, million-plus cities are not really that common across the world. It's common in India, but 50+ more of it. If we're looking in Europe, Bordeaux is a big city by French standards, 1 million people, right? So at what level of agglomeration do the gains start to die down or slow down? That's not a question that we've been able to answer very well. I mean, there's some numbers out there which is, hey, the paper out in China, which is Chinese cities are too small, they should be 50 million. We haven't had one yet, Tokyo, Osaka, somewhere there. But so one of the things that we basically said is yes, but look and see at what levels and what spaces stuff is already happening at what scale. So a place like Tiruchengode, if it can, what we call a micropolis, can actually perform a lot of the function that you're looking for at a wholly different scale, then perhaps you need to think about the way the urban transformation is happening somewhat differently, right? So that was one of the core insights and stuff that we're trying to move forward into that space. Locating it very much within that context, but saying, yes, but this is what your theory doesn't exactly expound upon, and therefore how you need to put that stuff in place. On specifics, let us say, we have done I think our engagements on the way we worked out our hybrid annuity road model, which is used both for our roads and highways and also for that matter, our sewage treatment plants and so on and so forth, is actually an innovation that's not that much elsewhere that one has seen. And we haven't gone around sort of making a case for it, both within the country and across. But, and it is again one of those things which was introduced within the government, I think, in 2005. And then at that time, there were other ideas on the table that people found more acceptable and exciting. It wasn't until the highway sector and the toll road projects collapsed, the drop in traffic and so on and so forth, and that when this new government came back in this first round in 2014, that they said, okay, what can we do to revive the sector? Had some discussion. There was this stuff that was lying around. Can you try this out? Yes. And they changed things around, and that's how that stuff came into being. Well, maybe 8-9 years after it first went into the government system, right? So it's, but most cases, some things don't work. Let's say I'm talking about gross cost contracts and buses where you don't, the bus fellow doesn't collect. What's happening in Delhi is the bus fellow doesn't collect the fare, somebody else is collecting fares. He is the institution is basically just ensuring that buses run to schedule on time, etc. No, but how would they pay for themselves? This is, doesn't make sense. So there is often alternative narrative that is saying that this is not the right model. And that kind of contestation would be taking place in many places, right? So it isn't as if that ideas are not spreading because people are sitting in their hunches. There's obviously inertia. What is old stays, and changing something requires. But even when you recognize the need for change, there are often many competing models for change. And in the different circumstances, different things sort of get chosen, which is precisely the point I was making earlier, that if you insisted on uniform models across spaces, you would not realize whether or not. I personally might think the best way to do this is do gross cost models across the entire face of the country. And I'm going to argue strongly for that. But there will be like 3 states will say, oh, what a stupid idea. I'm not going to do anything like this. And maybe they're right. And maybe 5 years down the line, we find out that what they said was right. And we have something to draw upon because they didn't do it. Or if I, by some happy circumstance, really turn out to be right, then maybe they'll shift 5 years down the line later. But having that option is valuable. And one should recognize that value of diversity, right? So these are true for whether you're looking at things like, for example, the other interest, these trust that we are now having towards. I personally think that fecal sludge treatment plants instead of sewage, drainage and sewage is a better idea than drainage and sewage, because to me it looks as if current water and drainage systems take up too much water and too much energy to push the sewage across the sewage treatment plants, etc. Both energy and water are in short supply in a climate world, and therefore having a system whereby you have localized treatment with septic tanks, taking it out and transporting it somewhere else. These transportation can also be done by green vehicles, could be electric powered, etc., etc. So even the transportation, if you use less water, you might use less energy in transporting it, and whatever energy used can be green energy. All of that stuff is in place. And therefore, I think instead of cities doing sewage systems, it should be focusing much more like Metro Manila on doing a lot of septic tanks and fecal sewage treatment by design and not by compulsion. A lot of these places, it still happens because I don't have the money yet to move into a water supply and drainage system, but I'm saying don't do it. That's another kind of divergence into where we want to take things forward. Some places, especially smaller towns, are taking it up very rapidly, and that's because people have invested in septic tanks. And therefore, the government is now responding by putting together some ways of servicing them and making sure they're treated instead of putting it together. So it's these kinds of shifts in broad things. So how somebody treats shit sounds like a particularly boring question for policy, but it may actually have fairly large, it can actually be one of those big climate sexy resilience questions that we don't think about. So it's a question of how, if one is able to have the ability to think through these processes, think about what is driving the incentives and part of the government. Contractors will have the incentive of building large sewage pipes, so the large construction contracts with lots of attendant benefits. And also thinking about how people will respond, thinking about how the essentially proposition is actually put forward, are articulating the climate benefits properly, are people taking it into mind when they're putting these things together. That's the kind of dialogue that you want places to be immersed in. And that's the kind of questions or the kind of what engaging with people at CPR does is tell you that this is the kind of question you should be asking. We can help you answer some of them. There may be better people to answer others. But having this kind of structured thought process would hopefully lead to more sustainable and durable decisions going forward that you don't have to unwind 5-10 years down the line.
I don't know enough about septic tanks to jump on this campaign, but your free buses idea, I'm absolutely all for.
Good. So you'll hopefully see much more on that in the days to come.
I think we'll come to our final few questions because I've taken plenty of your time. I think one of the things I find younger folks, particularly around me, constantly interested in are suggestions for ways forward or how they can get into this space to learn from those before and also where you think things stand today. So one is broadly, so not specific then to your areas of research. What advice would you give to younger scholars who are trying to enter the policy space in India? Should they be focusing on their PhDs? Should they take the time to write? Should they learn?
Come work with CPR. No, but honestly, there's more than a grain of truth. And CPR could be CPR, I hope. We always love having smart young people around us. But there are some other options, obviously. I think young people don't realize how much time they actually have. Partly it's a result of our parents, but they don't realize that, especially in places like this, a couple of years of investing in yourself will pay rich dividends and really doesn't matter when you consider the fact that you're going to have a 40-year career going forward. People are, but my classmate finished X at some point in time. So one of the things I would ask them to, it's okay to take your time and explore a couple of areas that you're interested in. You may want to be you're excited. You might find yourself getting excited eventually by selling soap, and that's perfectly wonderful because somebody has to, right? And there'll be somebody who will be, I know a young friend of mine who is currently working to make sure that you can deliver nicotine to people without actually delivering the tar. I find that a lot of people might find that disturbing, but but heck, if people are going to remain addicted to nicotine, they may as well sort of get it in the safest way as possible. So there are different and completely ways that, but you might end up getting fascinated with how government works, how change happens, how people respond and impact to those kinds of changes. And there is nothing better than spending time with institutions who are actually doing that before you settle on to whatever you want to do your PhD in. Now, some of these places may, our leadership at CPR, some of them do have PhDs, some of them don't have PhDs. So it isn't the sine qua non of being able to participate in this space. And in some places it's helpful and depends on, to me, it's, for a curious mind, it is, I think, a very useful disciplining experience to go through a PhD program. And that, I think, is valuable and was proved valuable to me. But it need not necessarily be for everyone. Right? But to try and figure out whether or not this kind of work is something that you would enjoy, and enjoy for a significant period of time in your life. You don't have to do it all your life. Is something that you can only decide if you spend time in it. And definitely, I've had young people who have come while they were doing their undergraduates. I was very skeptical whether that would be a good decision. In a couple of instances, I was very, very pleasantly surprised. And some of those people have ended up being great researchers. But definitely after you have done your master's in a discipline that you've liked, it's a good place for you to come and check out whether or not you want to do policy work before you tend to actually go out and acquire more further academic qualifications. So I would strongly urge people to work before they commit to getting academic training in a policy area. And work with any area that sort of intrigues you. A place like CPR allows people to work across a variety of spaces and engage with a variety of people across a variety of spaces. But you might be really committed to education, that's perfectly fine. You work with groups which are working on education, other people working on sanitation, somebody else is working on energy, and those are perfectly fine places to go to. So it's important, but definitely a couple of years of good, hard, serious work before you start thinking about whether you want to stay in the field and get further academic training is something that I would strongly recommend.
To narrow it maybe a bit further then to your fields, let's say, which let's cover urbanization, work, migration, and so on. Are there either areas of research or tools of research that you wish that you would point younger folks towards? Are there things in the urban world that you would like to see more questions answered, or approaches to research that you want to see?
People tend to sort of fall in quantitative and qualitative kind of boxes. And I think those are constraining boxes. And it's important for people to understand what data means, how information becomes data and how that is analyzed. So that's important for people to understand. And similarly, it's important for people were working purely with data and numbers to actually being able to think through the processes that producing those kinds of outcomes to the much more qualitative kind of structures in place, right? But the one area where I think there is a significant lack at this point in time is we still don't have enough people who think spatially in the urban space. And that's important because in urban and anything else, location matters. And where something is located by itself, we have enormous amounts of satellite data, structures, etc., linking that to other forms of data and information, and then trying to analyze what difference is the location of a particular kind of activity making, the scale and whatever else it is, I think, a question that is, especially in India, could help with more researchers coming in, because the kind of people who get training in these kinds of spaces and would be in hard geography or geospatial geoinformatics labs, etc., but they're just looking at it, but they're not being able to relate it to kind of questions on the ground. So they have the tools, but they don't have the questions. And other people have the questions, but they don't have the tools. And institutions like CPR are able to build teams which can do these things together, but be useful as you go forward, and these tools become more and more easier to process and understand, for people to get an understanding of these kinds of stories. Because eventually, in any cases, ChatGPT is going to be doing all your writing for you anyway. So what you need to do is to make sure that the empirical basis for what you are actually writing together is supported. And that is the structure that I think, if one is looking at particular tools in analysis going forward, there is definitely, standard things that people talk about in terms of programming and software, etc. But if talking about this area of space, I think thinking about things spatially and picking up the tools required to analyze spatially, I think, is something that would be really useful going forward.
I think blurring lines is clearly a big thrust, whether it's formal, informal, rural, urban, quantitative, qualitative, and so on. There's a clear through line, I think. Great. No, I think just the final question then. For anyone who's listened or read this interview and is curious about your work or would like to go read further, are there 3 things that you would point to, journal articles or even op-eds or things that you would say not encapsulate your work, but you'd like to point people to as things they can follow up on?
That's hard. One of them, which I think was the most extensive, is the Committee on the Allocation of Natural Resources. That's not in the public domain, except in a sort of, there is a website which has a version of that report. In terms the work that people talk about most and associated with, there is a set of pieces, but I think the summary piece would be the one that's come out in IJUR, the International Journal for Urban and Regional Research, which is called Indian Insights for Urbanization Theory, and it's and the follow on from that you might want to sort of put together in space. Then there is a piece perhaps in seminar that sort of came out some time ago on formality and formality, and that I would sort of, which has never been fully expanded. Therefore, I wouldn't blame people if they sort of find that very not particularly useful going forward in many respects. Finally, there is the work on SEZs, but there is actually a piece which may be available I don't know if it's easily available on the web. Maybe one should pull it out. It's called Do De Novo SEZs Make Sense? And that's sort of work that was done while I was at IDFC, which I don't know whether it has authorship on that particular story. A group of us at the Production Project Group was working in that space. Part of that stuff then came into the book with Lorraine and Rob on politics, power, and protest. But it's in that space, and then that would be. I mean, there's other stuff, but that's more technical, and so these would be, I think, in the kinds of spaces. The other space which one has read and thought and engaged a lot with, hasn't written enough about yet, or not yet, almost not at all, is working on China. So there's a piece in a book by Ashok Gurung, Brian McGrath, which actually is a little bit of a comparative piece on China with two of my other colleagues who are both senior planners and administration officials in China, which and that I think is an interesting book to put together. I can most probably send those links across so they can come through when it goes through.
We'll try and link to those if they're available for public consumption. And yeah, as it's clear with your reference to China at the end, there's loads we haven't been able to get to, even just on the list of questions I had and the ones I knew I wouldn't be able to get to anyways. But no, thank you so much for being on, Dr. Mukhopadhyay. It's been enlightening, and thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you for listening to CPR Perspectives. Subscribe to this podcast feed for future interviews. And you can also sign up to our newsletter, which will be linked to in the show notes. For more information on CPR's work, you can follow the Center on Twitter at CPR_India and log on to the website at www.cprindia.org. I'm at Rohan V on Twitter, and you can also read my newsletter, India Inside Out, on Indian politics, foreign policy, and history at rohanvenkat.substack.com.